What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas on the podcast once again. The podcast known as the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, coming to you live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, bringing you another edition of the T-Take. And I hopped on a little bit earlier today to tell the Bills fans, hey, I see some negativity out there. Cut it out. I ain't liking it. I like positive reinforcement. Whether you actually believe that the Buffalo Bills made the right decision in Josh Allen over Josh Rosen is one thing. But now that Josh Allen is a Buffalo Bill, let's embrace this guy. Let's not throw him, toss him to the curb, throw him to the wolves just yet. Before he plays it down on the Buffalo Bills roster, on the Buffalo Bills as a Buffalo Bill. Before he plays it down as a Buffalo Bill, let's slow our roll here, and really embrace this kid. Allow him to come in, learn the offense, and prove himself. Because realistically, that's what every player deserves, that honor of proving themselves before we judge a book by its cover. That's the saying. Don't judge a book by its cover. Let the player prove himself. So, back on the podcast once again to bring you another edition of the Thomas Take, and this one is obviously a Thomas Take audio version. I usually do these visually lately, adding these onto the YouTube, but I want to add some more audio files to the YouTube channel so people can listen to those on the go without feeling like they can, that they have to watch the episodes. So here I am, back on the podcast audio and streaming from Spreaker.com. So, this edition of the podcast is geared towards a sport known as mixed martial arts, and everybody knows full well that I'm a mixed martial arts writer, have covered mixed martial arts plenty of times on the show, and there's a lot of news circulating around a fight that I got to be honest with you, right out of the gate here, I'm scratching my head a little bit at the idea of this fight. So, the idea of the fight is, according to UFC President Dana White, George St. Pierre, the former UFC welterweight and middleweight champion, taking on Nate Diaz. And Nate Diaz, well known for his victory over Conor McGregor, has never won a title, challenged for the UFC lightweight title, and obviously defeated the then UFC featherweight champion at welterweight versus Conor. And about between Conor and Nate, the first one was at 170, as was the second one, but, they obviously split. And probably 2013, 2012, George St. Pierre fought and resoundingly defeated Nick Diaz. I believe it was in 2013. Nick Diaz, the brother of Nate, obviously. The fight wasn't even close. One of the most lopsided fights in GSP's career, where he landed 11, I think maybe 12 takedowns in that fight. So there's a lot of layers to this, and I really want to dive into it. I feel like this matchup is a pure head-scratcher due to the fact that GSP, his last fight, was at 185 pounds. He'll have to drop down 30 pounds to get down to 155. Dana White said, from Dana White's lips to my ears, as I was listening to the UFC Unfiltered podcast with Jim Norton and Matt Serra, that this fight will take place at 155 pounds, which I am excited in one respect, because that division is so stacked. George St. Pierre is the biggest name, I think, in UFC history outside of Conor. And there's a lot of massive matchups for GSP at that weight class. GSP versus Conor being one of them. GSP versus Habib. GSP versus Kevin Lee. I mean, there's a lot of good fights out there for GSP at 155 pounds. GSP versus Eddie Alvarez. I mean, there's some really, really good fights in that weight class. And I enjoy the idea of those fights, as a fan, but the idea of this fight in particular. Nate Diaz has been out of the octagon for 2 years. He's wanted that high-profile matchup. He said he wouldn't come back to fight anybody but Conor. And he has stuck to his word. He has not fought since his second fight versus Conor McGregor, a fight that was a loss at the hands of McGregor. But Nate fighting GSP I'm just not seeing it as a real sell due to the fact that GSP already resoundingly beat Nick Diaz back in the day. They're practically the same fighter. I mean, I think Nate Diaz is a little bit better. He's a little bit more well known and has really grown in a lot of different ways throughout his career. Whereas Nick has stepped his foot in, stepped his foot out. Nate Diaz has always been a constant. Has he taken breaks now and then? Yes, he has, and he's in the midst of one of those breaks. But it seems like Nate Diaz has kind of really stayed true to being a fighter, whereas Nick Diaz has had some issues outside the cage and has kind of said, well, I really need to do this. He's got enough money as it is with everything that he's got going for him. So I'm just not seeing this fight as a fight that really gets my juices flowing. Will it excite me if it gets made? 100%. Will I watch it? 100%. But out of all the fights for GSP, I don't think Nate Diaz is the fight that really jumps out at me. You know, I honestly thought maybe if they wanted to do a rematch with GSP and Nick Diaz, that would make more sense, being that they fought before, and Nick Diaz took a long break. GSP took a long break to beat Bisping. Both fighters, essentially, GSP's fought one fight in 4 years. Nick Diaz has fought once the last 3 years. That would make more sense, especially being that they've already fought before. But now you have Nate Diaz looking to get a comeback fight, looking to get a fight where he gets paid. Really, the only other guy to do that outside of Conor is GSP. So in the pay scale aspects of this, it does make sense. But for the careers of both fighters, a win over Nate Diaz for GSP, it puts him in somewhat title contention. But we're talking about a fighter that his last two victories, one was a title defense and the other was a title victory, a victory for a separate world title in another weight class. If GSP comes back again, I think he should get a title shot at whatever weight he decides to compete in, whether it's 155, 170, or even 185 again. He should get a title shot. He won a title, vacated it, due to the fact that 185 is not his natural weight class by any stretch of the imagination. If he thinks that 155 is more of his natural weight class, he should get a title shot in that weight. If he really wants to extend his legacy, fighting the undefeated Khabib Nurmagomedov for the UFC 155-pound title, being one of the first fighters to fight in 3 different weight classes for a title, possibly the first fighter to ever win 3 belts in 3 different weight classes. That is a sell to me, not GSP versus Nate Diaz. And in terms of Nate Diaz, a fight that I think has made all the sense in the world, that has eluded Nate Diaz his entire career, that has a backstory behind it, that has 3 to 4 years worth of history behind it, is a fight with Nate Diaz and Eddie Alvarez. Moments after Eddie Alvarez beat Gilbert Melendez, Nate Diaz was flipping out saying that he wanted to fight him next, and that was 3, 4, almost 5 years ago. So let's go. Let's make that one happen. What's the holdup with that? I know Eddie Alvarez needs a new contract. I know Nate Diaz wants to get paid. Pay them both. The UFC, you made $4.25 billion and fighters are still not getting paid fairly. Doesn't make much sense to me. If I'm Dana White and I want to sell tickets, I'm putting GSP in a title fight again. Especially with Conor out. With Conor out, with this law stuff in June, whatever, we don't know what's going to happen with it. I'm highly expecting him to get a slap on the wrist and not get much punishment whatsoever. Being that it's a first-time offender, first-time felony charge for McGregor. But regardless, if Dana really wants to put some butts in the seats and doesn't know how long it's going to take for Conor to come back, if GSP realistically wants to move to 155, which I think he does, because he's looked a lot slighter, a lot slimmer lately throughout his Instagram and social media stuff, then give him the title shot versus Khabib. We're actually asking ourselves who's the rightful challenger, because they're so well versed and stuff, but there are fights to be made. Eddie Alvarez, Nate Diaz, Eddie Alvarez, Dustin Poirier, Kevin Lee could definitely fight Dustin Poirier as well. So, being that that's the case, if they feel like they're one fight away from getting a title shot, maybe GSP should cut in line again. It's just a thought. Just a thought. Nate Diaz could fight Kevin Lee. I mean, there's a lot of Rubik's Cube matchmaking that could take place in this weight class, because it's so dynamic, so deep, and I call it the UFC Shark Tank of the world. I really think that the 155-pound division is the Shark Tank of the UFC, along with 170. So there you have it, my thoughts on the possibility of Nate Diaz taking on George St. Pierre. I think if George is coming back, it's got to be a title fight, right? Take care, everybody.